All right, we're going to be talking about evolution, which is also known as descent with modification. Before we begin, just to say that I know many of you will struggle with this concept because you believe that faith and science are mutually exclusive. In other words, you cannot be a person of faith and at the same time adhere to scientific theories, particularly in this area. And I want to just say that that is not the case. In fact, many people who are scientists are actually people of faith, Christians or Buddhists or Muslims or Hindus or whatever the case may be. So don't feel that there needs to be this dichotomy between the two. Actually, they are mutually compatible. Okay, so firstly, just to specify that when we use the word evolution, what we're actually talking about is biological evolution. So evolution simply means change over time. So when you get up in the morning and you get dressed, you have changed. You've changed your appearance. When you tie your hair up, when you put makeup on, when you change your shoes, you have changed. That's not the evolution we're talking about. Biological evolution refers to genetic changes in populations over successive generations. Most of the evolution that we see is as a result of natural selection. We're going to get to that. Okay, so just to confirm, this is evolution. This is not what we're talking about. When we talk about scientific theories, many people will respond by saying, oh, it's just a theory. That's the incorrect use of the word theory when we come to science. So in science, there are these three words that you need to know: fact, hypothesis, and theory, scientific theory. So a fact is something that you can verify. You can go and check it out and actually see the thing for yourself. So it's a piece of information or something about an event that's occurred. A hypothesis, this is what we work with most often. It's a proposal. It's an educated guess about what might have happened. It's intended to explain facts or to explain observations, things that you've seen. A theory, this is where we have a bunch of hypotheses that have been tested. We have a number of facts that have been shown to be true, and we put those all together in some kind of explanation about the natural world. So, for example, we would ask, what and how does it all work? It's a specific set of phenomena that we're trying to explain. The theory of gravity, for example, is a theory which explains a bunch of observations and hypotheses, which then led us to accept that certain facts were true. Now, evolution is a theory in that sense, that it is an explanation about a bunch of observations and a number of facts, which puts it all together in a way that makes sense for everybody. So it makes sense about the formation of new species, and it makes sense of the biodiversity that we see today. Just to recap, what is a species? Now, last year in grade 11, we did population ecology. In grade 10, we did classification. And in each of these, we've spoken about a species. So when we talk about a biological species, or the explanation for a biological species, we need these three things. You've got organisms of the same type that are able to interbreed freely and produce fertile offspring. In other words, their offspring are able to reproduce. Now, I should point out that there are massive conferences held every year all around the world by biologists to try and come up with a unified species definition. The reason being that because of viruses and bacteria, our definition of species doesn't work so well. With plants too, this particular definition of species doesn't work so well. However, it's the best tool that we have, and so that's what we're going to stick with for the moment. When we talk about evolution, there's microevolution and there's macroevolution. Microevolution, I'm sure that none of you have an issue with. It's the changes that we see within one species. Okay, so if you look, some human beings are very short, some human beings are very tall, and if that's a response to their environment, then that would be a microevolutionary change. If you look at human beings 500 years ago and human beings today, in general, we are taller. We are better built and we are healthier. And that's as a result of both an increased access to food and improved technology. However, if you look at our baby toes, over the last 500 years, our baby toes have decreased in size. And that is as a result of wearing shoes. and the impact that wearing shoes has had on us. Those are microevolutionary changes. Macroevolution, and this is the one that most people have an issue with, is the development of new species from an earlier species. And many people accept that microevolution takes place. We can see variation in a population over time, but they don't accept that microevolutionary changes can accumulate to form macroevolutionary changes. And we'll come to that. Okay, so let's look at microevolution. Now, microevolution, you're not going to be examined on these terms in your matric paper, but if you're going to go on to university level, knowing these things will make a significant difference for you. So when we talk about microevolution, these are the 5 things that participate in or are mechanisms for microevolution. Genetic drift, this is where the genome that you have drifts in a particular direction, usually as a result of a bottleneck. It could be something else as well, but most often it's a bottleneck. And bottlenecks occur because of particular events that have taken place. So in the Western Cape, or in the southwestern part of South Africa, we have a cheetah population that are indigenous to this area. They're in fact endemic to this area. When you look at the cheetahs that we have, we see that our cheetahs have a very, very small gene pool. Their genome is significantly reduced. This is as a result of a bottleneck that took place because of farmers. This, of course, is hailing back to the days when the Cape was a colony, when the Dutch East India Company arrived, and then Britain took over, and there was this antipathy between the Boers and the English. And so the Boers started trekking, and they moved out. During that whole time, farms were set up in the various areas, and farmers were allowed to go and stake out a farm for a small fee, and there was very little control about what they were doing or the impact they were having on the environment. In that time, obviously, they were farming cattle and sheep, and so cheetahs would come down and would start stealing their cattle and their sheep, and they just started shooting them. There was no kind of catch and release program like we have today. They simply were slaughtered. And that slaughtering of cheetahs resulted in a bottleneck. It dramatically reduced, if you think of the bottleneck of a wine bottle, it dramatically reduced the genome, the number of different alleles that were present in the whole cheetah population. So much so, in fact, that our cheetahs today are extremely vulnerable to viral attacks. There's a wine farm out near Stellenbosch called Spear, who are involved in a cheetah program to try and broaden and widen the genome of the cheetahs again, and they're trying to crossbreed them with some other cheetahs from elsewhere in Africa to try and protect them and to increase their genes. At the same time, they're trying to educate farmers to not capture them. So that is genetic drift, okay, where you've got a significant change and either a kind of moving to one end of a spectrum, or where particular alleles just no longer are present. Gene flow is similar to genetic drift, but significantly different. So gene flow occurs where you've got individuals from different populations coming in together. So either, for example, in our cheetah example, if we've got cheetahs coming from a North African population, they will have different genes, and they then assimilate into the Western Cape population, and they bring with them the genes that they carry, obviously. And so those alleles then get introduced into the genome of the Western Cape population. That is gene flow. Mutations, obviously when your DNA is in the process of being copied, mutations can occur, cancers can occur, exposure to radiation or poisons can cause mutations to occur. All kinds of things can cause mutations. And those mutations can result in changes that are then passed on to the offspring, okay, significant changes. We see this, for example, if you look at flies. Flies have especially fruit flies, have a very short lifespan of only a few weeks. If you breed them in captivity by introducing a slightly different environment, you will see that they change very, very quickly. So, for example, white eyes versus red eyes. You can force that change to happen very, very quickly because of a mutation as a result of what you've exposed them to. Non-random mating. Now, technically, mating should be random at all times. When we look at various definitions, if you go back to what we did in DNA, we spoke about what are the mutations that give, or what are the sources of variation that increase variation in a species. And one of those that we spoke about was random mating. Now, the reality is that in many populations, there is not random mating. There is, in fact, non-random mating. So if you think, if you have an alpha male, that alpha male will mate with all the females in his group. That is non-random mating. The females don't get a choice in terms of which male they are mated with, in terms of which alleles, therefore, they get. That's a non-random mating. And if you've got non-random mating, it can mean that the frequency of certain alleles increases, for example, size or color or hair length or whatever it might be. The last one is natural selection. Now, natural selection is something that occurs as a result of what nature is doing. So nature is the one that selects. This is kind of really important. We'll come back to this when we look at Darwin and we look at Darwin's theories. Natural selection is really, really important as a mechanism for microevolution. Essentially, what natural selection says is that the organisms that are best suited, in other words, the organisms that already have adaptations that make them better suited to the environment than a neighbor, are more likely to find food, be healthy, be strong. They're more likely to find a mate. They're more likely to reproduce. They're more likely to pass on their genes. So where natural selection occurs, you will see that a population tends to have more individuals that look the same or that have the same kind of alleles, because those particular alleles give them an advantage in that environment. It's not a positive negative thing. It's not, so if we look at basketball players are always taller than everybody else, and therefore being tall is a good thing. If we had a different sport, for example, if we have randomly picking something out of the air here, shot put, then maybe being shorter and squatter is a good thing. So it's not that we attach a value to that particular characteristic. It is simply that in that current environment, that characteristic, that adaptation gives you an advantage. If the environment changes, then obviously the characteristics that you need will be different. Many people think that evolution means that we are an end product. So we look at human beings, we look at humanity and we go, that's the end product. This is what human beings look like. Forgetting that we are still experiencing natural selection, although different because we make use of technology, which other species and animals and plants and things don't have. But we're still experiencing natural selection, and therefore we are not the end product. We are still in the process of changing, and the way that we change will depend on the environment around us. Okay, let's just look at some examples of microevolution. So here we've got some house sparrows. I'm sure you've seen common garden sparrows, the Cape sparrow in your gardens, the one with a little white C around its eye. If not, go into your garden and have a look. Anyway, house sparrows, a particular species of sparrow. This house sparrow was taken to America in 1852. And here we are 200 odd years later. And what we've seen is that those sparrows that have spread and that live in the north of North America, in general, they tend to be bigger. When you compare them to the house sparrows that are in the south of North America, which are smaller. And the reason for that is because of temperature. The bigger your body, the smaller your surface area to volume ratio will be, which means the less heat you will then lose to the environment. The smaller you are, the bigger your surface area to volume ratio is, and therefore the more heat you lose to the environment. So small birds in northern North America don't do very well because they don't survive very well through the winter period. They lose too much heat, there isn't enough food available for them to survive, and so they die. Whereas the larger birds are selected for in North America, because having that smaller surface area to body ratio, they lose less heat, therefore they require less food to maintain their body heat, and therefore they survive better. Some other examples, which we're going to look at again later on when we look at evolution in current times, is antibiotic resistance, pesticide resistance, and mosquito resistance to DDT. DDT is a pesticide that you use to kill mosquito larvae or mosquitoes, which means they then cannot pass on various diseases that they might carry. Another example here, dogs. So all dogs belong to the same species, which is Canis lupus familiaris. The wolf is Canis lupus, which is an ancestor for the modern day dog. So here you can see that from that modern day dog, we've got a number of variations that have occurred. All of these dogs are the same species. They may not look it, but they are all the same species. And so this is microevolution at work. Now, this microevolution has been driven by selective breeding, where human beings have selected. So this is not natural selection. This is artificial selection, where human beings have gone, I want a big dog, or I want a small dog, or I want a fluffy dog, whatever it might be, and then breed that particular thing. But the result is that microevolution has taken place. This is another example from the wild. This particular butterfly, Bicyclus anynana, you can see the variation in these wings. And what we're looking at particularly is the variation in these eye spots. So here you've got one really big one. There's one really tiny one. There you've got a number of different eye spots. And this is all in one species of butterfly. Obviously, the eye spot or the presence of eye spots will be driven by the predators that are in the area. The more predators you have, the more likely you are to have big eye spots. Macroevolution. Okay, so macroevolution, there are a number of patterns that we can see. The first pattern is no change. So in other words, macroevolution doesn't really take place at all. We call that stasis. We're going to come back to this example of the coelacanth as a living fossil, but essentially what it means is that over millennia, there's very little change in your appearance. Then you can have this other type of macroevolution where you don't necessarily become a different species in the sense that one fish becomes a reptile, but you do become a different type of species of the same type. So here you've got a whole bunch of different trilobites. What we see in the fossil record is that over time, the number of these different segments, these ribs that you can see in the trilobites, increases over time. And that is a macroevolutionary change, because as it develops more segments, we then give them a different species name. So these are all actually different species of trilobites, but we can trace them all back to a simpler form which came before. Here's another example. This is a horse, and so is this. This is the ancestral horse. This is the modern day horse. And what we see in the fossil record are these microevolutionary changes accumulating as a macroevolutionary change. If you look at this thing and you look at this thing, you can see that they're not the same. They are different species. But what has happened is that we've had a series of microevolutionary changes, which has resulted in a macroevolutionary change. Speciation is where one species changes so significantly that each population in essence becomes a new species. So here we have an original species. Remember, this thing is called a phylogenetic tree. We have our ancestor down at the bottom, and our ancestor gives rise to 3 different species, A, B, and C, each of which then continue to experience speciation such that we now have a significant number of new species at present day. Remember, this is time going from however many millions of years ago to 0, which is today. This is another example of macroevolution. So here is our ancestor, our common ancestor, and these two were the 2 original species. This species has continued to evolve to become the modern day hippopotamus. These are all of the species that we see in the fossil record, resulting in the modern day dolphins and orcas and that sort of thing. You can see the whale down the bottom there, continuing to present day. So again, this is microevolutionary changes accumulating such that we end up with macroevolution, new species being formed. The other pattern that we sometimes see with macroevolution is what's called extinction. So when the environment changes, if we go back to natural selection, when the environment changes, certain species are no longer suitable for the environment. Now, when we were in grade 10, you did the history of life on Earth, and we learned about the various extinction events. So if we think about the KT extinction, a significant amount of species on the planet disappeared. And that's what we're seeing here in this phylogenetic tree. So here is our common ancestor, and all of these species here have become extinct at that event, and a few species have continued to survive. The ones that survive, it could just be pure luck. So if you think of a volcanic eruption, the volcano erupts on one side, and all the endemic species on that one side get wiped out. The species that happen to exist on the other side of the volcano don't get wiped out, and they continue. It could be pure luck. Or it could simply be that the environment has changed in such a way that all of these species which relied on the same food source are no longer able to get that food and die, whereas this particular one had a different food source, and so it was able to survive, whatever it might be. So there are a number of reasons why an extinction might occur, and there are a number of reasons as to why those particular species survive. But this is an extinction event, which is also a pattern that we see in macroevolution.